It is one of those peculiar facts of my life that I have often found myself seated at Baker Street in circumstances which, had they been described to me beforehand, I should have declared impossible. And yet impossibility has a way of losing its authority when confronted by Sherlock Holmes. On the evening of which I write, a thin rain was falling over London, the sort of rain that does not announce itself with violence but rather seeps into the city with patient persistence. The gas lamps along Baker Street glowed faintly through the mist, each halo of light appearing as though it was suspended in water. Holmes was in one of his moods of silent abstraction. He had not spoken for nearly an hour, and his long fingers were loosely steepled beneath his chin while his eyes fixed upon a point somewhere beyond the opposite wall, though I had long learned that what he appeared to see and what he actually observed were rarely the same thing. I was reading by the fire, though my attention drifted more often toward him than toward the page. It was in such stillness that the knock came. Not the casual knock of a neighbor, nor the confident rap of a man accustomed to waiting rooms, but something sharper, uneven, urgent, and betrayed by hesitation in the final strike. Holmes stirred immediately. "Watson," he said quietly without looking at me, "our visitor is both educated and frightened." I lowered my book. "You deduce that from the knock?" He finally turned his head slightly. "From the rhythm," he replied. "The first 2 strikes were controlled. The third was an afterthought." Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it is urgent. Won't give his name." Holmes rose at once. "Show him in." The man who entered was not remarkable at first glance. He was of middle age, dressed in the manner of a clerk or minor professional, though his coat was too fine for his posture and his posture too rigid for comfort. But it was his eyes that drew attention. They did not rest. They searched, as though the room itself might rearrange itself without warning. He hesitated just inside the doorway, then spoke. "Mr. Holmes, I am told you deal in matters that others call impossible." Holmes gestured toward the chair opposite ours. "Sit," he said simply. The man obeyed. Only then did I notice that his hands were stained faintly with ink, and something darker beneath it, as though he had been writing in haste under conditions less than ideal. Holmes observed him for a moment, then said, "You have come from the East End." The man startled slightly. "Yes," Holmes nodded. "And you did not take a cab directly here. You walked part of the way." "Yes," the man admitted, visibly unsettled. Holmes leaned back slightly. "Because you wished to ensure you were not followed." A pause. The man swallowed. "Yes." Holmes glanced briefly at me, as though to acknowledge a conclusion already reached, then said, "Now tell us why you believe you are in danger." The man hesitated, then reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. When he opened it, I saw that it was a sketch, a portrait. At first it appeared to be a woman elegant, seated, composed in the manner of a formal studio painting. Her expression was calm, her eyes directed slightly to the left of the viewer. But as I studied it more closely, I felt a faint unease. Something about the face was not fixed, not distorted, not incomplete, but uncertain. The man spoke quietly. "This portrait was painted 3 days ago. Holmes did not touch it." "And?" The man's voice lowered. "It changes." A silence followed. Even Holmes did not respond immediately. Then he said, "Explain precisely what you mean by changes." The man hesitated. "Every night," he said, "at exactly midnight the expression is different." I confess I exchanged a glance with Holmes at that moment, expecting the faintest trace of amusement or dismissal. There was none. Instead, he leaned forward slightly. "Different how?" The man swallowed. "The first night," he said, "she was smiling." "How?" The man swallowed. "The first night," he said, "she was smiling. The second—" A pause. "The third night she was looking directly at the viewer." His voice tightened. "And last night she was crying." A silence settled over the room. Outside, the rain continued its steady descent against the glass. Holmes did not move. Then he said, "You have examined the painting personally each time." The man nodded quickly. "Yes, I locked the studio myself. And yet it changes." Holmes leaned back slightly. It was not said with disbelief, nor acceptance, but with the calm recognition of a problem that had already begun to form its structure. "And who painted it?" Holmes asked. The man hesitated. "Her husband," he said. "A Mr. Adriambali." At the mention of the name, Holmes's expression shifted not dramatically, but perceptibly, as though a file had been retrieved from a vast internal archive. "Vale," Holmes repeated softly. "You know him?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead he said, "He exhibited once at the Royal Academy." A pause. 6 years ago. Then added quietly, "His work was noted for anatomical precision and emotional inconsistency." The man leaned forward urgently. "Mr. Holmes, I assure you this is not a matter of art criticism. Something is happening. The portrait is not merely changing, it is reacting." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "Reacting to what?" The man hesitated. "Midnight," he said simply. A silence followed that statement more profound than the others. Holmes rose and walked to the window. He stood there for some time, observing the fog beyond Baker Street, then spoke without turning. "Watson." "Yes? Do you recall my observation regarding human perception of continuity? That people assume stability even when none exists?" "Precisely," Holmes replied. He turned. "And yet," he said quietly, "this case suggests the opposite problem." I frowned. "And what is that?" Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "That stability is being imposed where none should exist." The man looked between us anxiously. "I don't understand," he said. Holmes returned to his chair. "You believe the portrait changes, but you also believe it remains the same object." The man nodded. Holmes said softly, "That is your first assumption." A pause. "And it may be incorrect." I felt a faint unease rise. "What alternative is there?" I asked. Holmes did not look at me immediately, then said, "That it is not the portrait that changes." A pause. "But the observer." The room fell silent again. The man's face went pale. "I am not imagining it," he whispered. Holmes nodded. "I did not say you were." A pause. "I said your reference point may be unstable." At that moment Holmes leaned forward, placing his fingertips together. "And now," he said quietly, "we must determine a very simple fact." The man looked up. "What fact?" Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Whether the painting changes at midnight." A pause. "Or whether something in your perception of midnight changes first." Outside, the clock of a distant church began to chime, slowly, measuringly, and as Holmes listened I noticed something I had not seen before in his expression. Not certainty, not doubt, but anticipation. The following morning broke under a sky so uniformly grey that London appeared less a city than a sketch unfinished by an impatient hand. The rain had ceased, but its presence lingered in the streets in the sheen of cobblestones, in the damp breath rising from the river, in the way even sound seemed reluctant to travel far. Holmes was already awake when I descended to breakfast. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that he was already dressed for departure, his overcoat buttoned, his gloves laid neatly beside his hat, and upon the table beside him lay the folded sketch of the portrait. He was examining it again, not with curiosity alone, but with the stillness of a man verifying a hypothesis he had not yet spoken aloud. "You have been studying it since dawn," I remarked. "I have been studying it since last night," Holmes replied. I poured myself tea. "And what conclusion have you reached?" Holmes did not look up. "None yet," he said. "But I have eliminated several comforting possibilities." There was a brief silence. Holmes finally folded the sketch and placed it in his coat pocket. "We shall visit Mr. Adrian Vale," he said. "You already know where he lives?" Holmes raised an eyebrow slightly. "He is an artist who does not sell his work widely, works irregular hours, and has recently ceased public exhibition." A pause. "Such men do not hide well in London. They merely reduce their radius of inconvenience." We took a cab eastward. As we travelled, Holmes remained unusually quiet, though not in the withdrawn manner of abstraction I had witnessed in earlier cases. This was different. He was attentive as though listening to a rhythm not audible to others. At one point I asked, "Do you believe the portrait truly changes?" Holmes considered the question carefully. "I believe," he said at last, "that something occurs at midnight." A pause. "But I am not yet convinced we are describing it correctly." The address led us to a narrow street behind Whitechapel High Road, where buildings leaned slightly inward, as though sharing secrets too heavy to support independently. Mr. Adrian Vale's studio occupied the upper floor of a former printing house. The lower level had long been abandoned, its windows boarded and its entrance marked only by peeling signage and neglect. Holmes stepped inside without hesitation. The interior staircase groaned under our weight, each step releasing a faint dust that had no intention of remaining settled. At the top a single door stood closed. Holmes knocked once. No response. He knocked again. Still nothing. Then he tried the handle. It opened. The studio was dimly lit, though not dark. Tall windows filtered the weak morning light into elongated shapes that stretched across canvases, tables, and easels like half-formed thoughts. And everywhere, dozens of them, all variations of the same subject. The woman, the face from the sketch, but each painting differed subtly from the others. In one she appeared serene, in another distracted, in another alarmed, and in one near the far wall she was looking directly at the viewer. Holmes stopped immediately. "So," he said quietly. "A pause. It is not a single portrait." I stepped closer, unsettled. "They are variations," I observed. Holmes nodded once. "Not variations," he corrected softly. "Iterations." A sound came from deeper within the studio. A chair shifting, then footsteps. A man emerged from behind a partition. He was younger than I had expected, though weariness had etched itself into his features in a way that made age difficult to assign. His hands were stained with paint, though not in the chaotic manner of an untidy artist. Rather, the stains were deliberate, almost ritualistic. He looked at us without surprise. "You have come about the portrait," he said. Holmes studied him. "Not a portrait," Holmes corrected. "The sequence." Vale did not respond immediately. Then he nodded slightly. "So it begins," he said quietly. Holmes walked slowly toward the canvases. "You are painting the same subject repeatedly," he observed. "Yes," Vale replied. "And each iteration differs." "Yes." Holmes turned. "And the differences follow a pattern." Vale hesitated. "They are not random," he admitted. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Describe the pattern." Vale looked uncomfortable now. "I paint her as I remember her," he said. A pause. "But my memory changes." Silence followed. Holmes turned slightly toward me. "Watson," he said quietly, "observe the phrasing." I considered it. "He is not saying the painting changes," I replied. Holmes nodded. "Precisely." Vale continued. "Each night I paint her again." A pause. "And each night she becomes less fixed." Holmes stepped forward slightly. "And what determines the change?" Vale hesitated. "I do not know." A pause. "But it happens at midnight." At that moment Holmes moved quickly toward one of the canvases. He examined it closely, then said softly, "There is no drying inconsistency." A pause. "No physical alteration mechanism." He turned toward Vale. "You are not repainting over the same canvas." Vale shook his head. "No." Holmes gestured. "These are separate works." A pause. "Then explain the continuity." Vale looked down. "I cannot." A silence followed. Then he said quietly, "But she remembers." That statement altered the atmosphere instantly. Holmes turned sharply. "What did you say?" Vale looked up. "The subject," he said slowly, "remembers what she was painted as before." I felt a faint chill. Holmes did not speak immediately. Then he asked, "You are suggesting the subject is aware of previous iterations?" Vale nodded. A pause. "And responds accordingly." Holmes stepped back slowly. "That is impossible," I said. Vale looked at me. "Then you have not observed the paintings at midnight." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You have?" Vale hesitated. A pause. "And what occurs?" Vale swallowed. "She looks at me differently." Holmes turned away slightly. I saw his mind working rapidly now, assembling structure from contradiction. Then he said quietly, "Watson, we are no longer dealing with a painting." A pause. "We are dealing with sequential perception." He turned back to Vale. "Tell me," Holmes said, "what happens at the moment of transition?" Vale hesitated. "Transition?" Holmes nodded. "From one iteration to the next." Vale looked uneasy. "I do not see it happen," he admitted. A pause. "I only notice it has happened." Holmes exhaled slowly. "And yet you continue to paint." Vale nodded. "Yes." A pause. "Because I must see what she becomes." Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then he said softly, "And if she becomes something you do not recognize?" Vale's voice lowered. "Then I paint again." At that moment Holmes stepped toward the largest canvas in the room, the one the client had shown us in sketch form. He studied it carefully, then said, "This is not representation." A pause. "This is accumulation." He turned to me. "Watson, consider this carefully." "Yes?" "If each painting reflects a previous state influenced by observation." A pause. "Then what determines the first state?" I hesitated. "I don't know." Holmes nodded. He looked back at Vale. "And therein lies the true mystery," he said quietly. A pause. Not what changes at midnight. Another pause. But what initiates the first change at all? Outside, a clock began to strike somewhere in the distance. Not midnight. Not yet. But the sound carried strangely through the studio, as though time itself were rehearsing a moment it had already experienced. Holmes stood still, and said quietly, "Watson, I believe we are being introduced to a painting that does not begin with the artist. A pause. But with the observer. There are certain investigations which begin with a crime. Others begin with a lie. This one, I was beginning to suspect, had begun with a memory. As Holmes and I departed Adrian Vale's studio, neither of us spoke for some distance. The streets of Whitechapel were alive with their customary activity, vendors calling from carts, factory workers hurrying through the morning haze, children darting between wagons with the reckless confidence of youth. Yet my thoughts remained fixed upon the studio, upon the dozens of portraits, upon the strange certainty with which Vale had described them, and most of all upon Holmes's final observation, a painting that did not begin with the artist, but with the observer. At length I broke the silence. "You believe Vale is deceiving us?" Holmes adjusted the collar of his coat against the chill wind. "No." The answer surprised me. "Then he truly believes the portraits change?" "Undoubtedly." "A delusion?" Holmes shook his head. "Perhaps, but delusions are valuable things, Watson." I looked at him curiously. "Valuable?" "Certainly." A faint smile crossed his thin face. "A man rarely invents a delusion without first encountering an uncomfortable truth." We arrived back at Baker Street shortly after noon. Holmes spent the remainder of the afternoon immersed in reference books, exhibition catalogues, newspaper archives, and several files from his own private collection. I had seen him conduct research in countless cases, yet there was something unusually methodical about his approach this time. He was not seeking a suspect, nor a motive, nor even a crime. He was seeking an origin. Shortly after 6 o'clock he sat back in his chair and lit his pipe. "I have found our first contradiction." I lowered my newspaper. "What contradiction?" Holmes tapped a file resting upon his knee. "Adrian Vale claims these portraits began 3 days ago." "Yeah." "They did not." That immediately captured my attention. "What do you mean?" Holmes handed me a clipping. It was from an art review published nearly 6 years earlier. The article discussed an exhibition at the Royal Academy. Most of it consisted of the usual observations one expects from critics attempting to appear profound. Yet one paragraph had been marked by Holmes. I read it aloud. "Among Mr. Adrian Vale's submissions is a curious portrait of a young woman whose expression appears strangely anticipatory. One has the odd sensation that she is observing the viewer rather than being observed herself." I looked up. "The same woman?" Holmes nodded. "The very same." I stared at him. "But that would mean that the sequence—" I stared at him. "But that would mean that the sequence began long before our client entered the story." Holmes rose immediately. "Call me, Watson." "Where are we going?" "The British Museum." The journey seemed absurd at first. I could not imagine what an ancient institution filled with relics and manuscripts might contribute to an investigation involving modern portraiture. Yet I had long ago learned that Holmes's detours were rarely accidental. By the time we arrived, dusk had settled over London. Gas lamps flickered into life. Their reflections trembled upon wet pavement like fragments of another city hidden beneath the first. Inside the museum, Holmes requested access to several archived exhibition records. The clerk, accustomed perhaps to eccentric scholars, eventually produced a collection of catalogues and registration documents. Holmes examined them carefully, then suddenly stopped. I leaned closer. "What is it?" Holmes pointed to a registration form. Adrian Vale. Title: Portrait of Eleanor. Date of completion: 6 years ago. "Eleanor?" I asked. Holmes nodded. A woman named Eleanor Ashcroft. The name meant nothing to me, but Holmes had already become thoughtful. "Eleanor Ashcroft." He repeated it slowly. Then his eyes sharpened. "I know that name." We returned to Baker Street late that evening. Holmes immediately consulted several old newspaper indexes. Within half an hour he located what he sought, a death notice, dated 7 years earlier. I read it twice before speaking. "Eleanor Ashcroft died?" Holmes nodded. A pause. 1 year before the first known portrait. I stared at him. The implication was obvious. "You mean Vale painted her after her death?" "Precisely." For several moments neither of us spoke. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows. Finally I said, "That changes everything." Holmes's expression became thoughtful. "No." A pause. "It changes nothing." I frowned. "Surely it does." Holmes shook his head. "The mystery remains identical." He leaned forward slightly. "The question was never whether the portraits changed." A pause. "The question was why." At 9 o'clock that evening there came another knock at our door. This time it was not our client. It was Inspector Lestrade. The Scotland Yard detective entered with unusual urgency. "I was looking for you, Holmes." Holmes gestured toward a chair. "What has happened?" Lestrade sat down heavily. "Another incident." The words immediately caught my attention. "What sort of incident?" Lestrade removed a notebook from his pocket. "A burglary." Holmes looked mildly disappointed. "Hardly unusual." Lestrade shook his head. "It occurred at Vale's studio." That changed everything. Holmes sat forward instantly. "When?" "An hour ago." "What was taken?" Lestrade hesitated. "Nothing." A silence followed. "Nothing?" I repeated. Lestrade nodded. "The place was searched thoroughly." A pause. "But no valuables were removed." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "What was disturbed?" Lestrade consulted his notes. "Only one thing." "Why?" "The earliest portrait." Holmes stood immediately. "The first one?" "It was removed from the wall." Lestrade nodded, "and left face down on the floor." A strange silence settled over the room. I looked toward Holmes. His expression had changed. Not alarm, not surprise, recognition, as though a long-anticipated move had finally appeared upon a chessboard. "What are you thinking?" I asked. Holmes replied quietly, "The burglar did not search the studio." A pause. "He searched the painting." Lestrade frowned. "What does that mean?" Holmes moved toward the mantelpiece. "It means someone believes the answer lies within the first portrait." A pause. "And if they believe that—" He looked toward me. "They may be correct." We left immediately. The journey back to Whitechapel felt longer than before. Fog had thickened across the city. Street lamps glowed like distant stars trapped in dirty glass. When we arrived at Vale's studio, the artist himself appeared shaken. His normally controlled manner had vanished. "They touched it," he whispered. Holmes ignored the emotional statement entirely. "Show me!" Vale led us toward a small side room. Unlike the main studio, this chamber contained only a handful of canvases. And there, resting upon a table, lay the earliest portrait, the first known image of Eleanor Ashcroft. Holmes approached slowly, then stopped. For several seconds he said nothing. At last he leaned closer, very close, examining details invisible to me. Then suddenly he became absolutely still. "Good heavens!" he murmured. I stepped forward. "What is it?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he pointed toward the lower left corner of the painting, near the edge of the canvas, almost hidden within the shadows. A reflection, tiny, barely noticeable. At first I thought it was merely an artistic flourish. Then realization struck me. The reflection depicted a figure, a man standing behind the subject, watching her. "What of it?" asked Lestrade. Holmes slowly straightened. His eyes remained fixed upon the canvas. "According to the exhibition records—" A pause. "This portrait was completed 6 years ago." Holmes pointed again, at the reflection, at the tiny figure hidden in shadow, then spoke very softly. "So explain this." I leaned closer, and suddenly my blood ran cold, because I recognized the face, not clearly, not perfectly, but unmistakably. It was Adrian Vale, 6 years younger, standing behind Eleanor Ashcroft, watching her. The problem was simple, and impossible. Because Eleanor Ashcroft had already been dead for an entire year when the portrait was painted. The discovery in the corner of the canvas altered the entire character of the investigation. Until that moment we had been occupied with a peculiar artistic mystery strange enough to warrant Holmes's attention, certainly, but still confined within the realm of observation and perception. Now we possess something different, a contradiction, and contradictions as Holmes often remarked, are the fingerprints of truth. The earliest portrait of Eleanor Ashcroft had been painted 1 year after her death, yet within the painted reflection stood Adrian Vale, apparently observing her in life. The impossibility was precise, and therefore valuable. For nearly half an hour Holmes examined the painting without interruption. Neither Lestrade nor I disturbed him. The studio remained silent save for the occasional crackle of coal from the small iron stove near the wall. At length Holmes straightened. Lestrade, who had been growing increasingly impatient, folded his arms. "Interesting?" he repeated. "A dead woman appears in a portrait painted after her death, and that's all you have to say?" Holmes ignored the irritation. Instead, he looked toward Vale. "Who discovered the reflection first?" The artist appeared startled. "The reflection?" "The figure behind Miss Ashcroft." Vale shook his head slowly. "I never noticed it." Holmes stared at him. For several seconds neither man spoke. Then Holmes nodded. "I believe you." The artist looked genuinely surprised. "You do?" "Certainly." A faint smile touched Holmes's lips. "You are a painter." A pause. "Painters rarely examine finished work as closely as investigators." Lestrade grunted. "I still don't understand how that helps us." Holmes turned toward him. "Because if Vale never noticed the reflection, he could not have added it intentionally for dramatic effect." A pause, which means it serves another purpose. As we departed the studio later that night, Holmes remained unusually thoughtful. The fog had grown denser. Street lamps appeared as floating circles of pale gold suspended in darkness. I walked beside him in silence until we reached the main road. Finally I said, "You believe the reflection is genuine?" Holmes adjusted his scarf. "I believe it was painted deliberately." "Then how do you explain it?" Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, if I could explain it, we should have no case." The following morning began with research, not into Adrian Vale, not into the portraits, but into Eleanor Ashcroft. Holmes spent hours examining newspaper archives while I assisted where possible. By midday we had assembled a rough outline of her life. She had been 28 years of age, educated, unmarried, comfortably wealthy, known within certain artistic circles, and dead. Her death had occurred 7 years earlier. Official cause: accidental drowning. A country estate near Richmond. Circumstances: she had apparently fallen from a private boathouse during an evening gathering. Her body was recovered from the river the following morning. No evidence of foul play had been found. Case closed. Holmes read the report twice, then a third time. Finally he placed it aside. "What do you see?" I asked. He answered immediately. "Nothing." I frowned. "Nothing?" "Precisely." He leaned back. "There is too little detail." That statement puzzled me. The report seemed thorough enough. Holmes tapped the page. "When newspapers describe an accidental death, they delight in detail." A pause. "Particularly when the victim is wealthy." He pointed toward the brief article. "This is restrained." I considered it, and slowly realized he was correct. The report contained facts, but remarkably few observations, no witness descriptions, no speculation, no dramatic embellishment, simply a concise account, almost as though someone had wished the matter forgotten. Holmes suddenly rose. "We shall visit Richmond." By early afternoon we were traveling southwest through increasingly open countryside. The transition from London to the river estates brought with it a strange sense of separation. The city's noise diminished. The air became cleaner, yet somehow the case felt darker here, closer to its source. The Ashcroft estate stood upon elevated ground overlooking a bend in the Thames. Though several years had passed since Eleanor's death, the property remained occupied. Its current owner proved cooperative after Holmes presented his card. Within an hour we were standing beside the old boathouse. The structure appeared ordinary enough. Weathered timber, stone foundation, river below. Nothing remarkable. And yet Holmes immediately became interested in the floor. "What is it?" I asked. He knelt, examining the boards carefully. Then he smiled. "The floor is old. Not old enough." He pointed toward several planks near the rear wall. "These were replaced." "A repair?" A pause. "Approximately 7 years ago, I felt a chill. The same year Eleanor Ashcroft died." Holmes rose slowly, then began examining the surrounding structure. Several minutes later he stopped near a support beam. At first I saw nothing unusual. Then Holmes directed my attention toward a series of faint marks in the wood. Scratches. Deliberate scratches, not random damage. I leaned closer. The inscription had faded considerably, yet enough remained to be legible. 3 words. He was here. A strange silence settled between us. The message appeared old, very old, certainly old enough to date from Eleanor's death. Holmes touched the carving lightly, then stepped back. I sighed. "There is that word again?" Holmes smiled. "It remains useful." A pause. "Because now we have a witness." The statement surprised me. "A witness?" Holmes pointed toward the carved message. "Someone wished to record a fact." A pause. "Not a warning, not a threat." Another pause. "An observation." As we continued our examination, the estate's caretaker approached. He was elderly and had worked on the property for decades. Holmes questioned him carefully. Most of his recollections proved unremarkable. Then Holmes mentioned Eleanor Ashcroft. The old man's expression changed immediately. "You remember her?" Holmes asked.
"Oh, yes."
A pause. "Everyone remembers Miss Eleanor." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Why?" The caretaker hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Because she kept talking about the painting." I exchanged a glance with Holmes. "What painting?" Holmes asked quietly. "The portrait?" The caretaker swallowed. "The one Mr. Vale painted?" A silence followed. Holmes stepped closer. "Eleanor Ashcroft discussed the portrait before her death?" "Constantly." The old man appeared uncomfortable now, as though speaking aloud thoughts long buried. "She said it wasn't finished." A pause. "Even after Mr. Vale insisted it was." Holmes said nothing. The caretaker continued. "She claimed something changed every night." My pulse quickened. "Changed how?" The old man shook his head. "I don't know." A pause. "But she became frightened." Holmes's voice grew very soft. "Did she ever explain why?" The caretaker looked toward the river. For several moments he remained silent. "She said the woman in the painting knew something." The words hung in the afternoon air. Even Holmes appeared thoughtful. "What did she mean?" I asked. The old man swallowed. "I never understood." A pause. "But she kept repeating the same thing." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "What thing?" The caretaker looked directly at him, and repeated the sentence exactly as he remembered it. "The woman in the portrait has seen the night I die." For several seconds no one spoke. The river moved quietly beneath the boathouse. A bird called somewhere in the distance, and yet the world felt suddenly colder. Holmes finally thanked the caretaker, then turned away. We walked several hundred yards before either of us spoke. At last I broke the silence. Surely she was imagining things. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he removed his pipe, lit it carefully, and stared across the water. "No, Watson." A pause. "I do not think she was imagining anything." I felt unease rising once more. Then what was happening? Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke, then said something that disturbed me more than any theory he had offered thus far. "I believe Eleanor Ashcroft knew she was going to die." A pause. "And I believe the portrait may be the reason she knew." As we turned back toward London, I glanced once more at the quiet boathouse, at the river, at the faded words carved into wood. He was here, a witness, a message, or perhaps something else entirely. For the first time since the case began, I found myself wondering whether the mystery was not about a changing portrait at all, but about a death that someone had spent 7 years trying to hide. The journey back from Richmond was undertaken beneath a sky the color of extinguished embers. Holmes spoke little, though I could see from the set of his jaw that his mind was far from idle. More than once he took out the sketch of the portrait and studied it by the dim light filtering through the carriage window. At last I said, "You believe Eleanor Ashcroft anticipated her own death." Holmes folded the paper carefully. "I believe she became convinced of it, and the portrait caused that conviction? Perhaps." A pause. "Or perhaps the portrait merely recorded something she had already perceived." I frowned. "You speak of it as though it were a witness." Holmes looked at me steadily. "In certain cases, Watson, objects become repositories of behavior. That sounds dangerously close to mysticism." A faint smile touched his lips. "Then let us avoid the language and keep the principle." A pause. "Repeated observation alters expectation. Altered expectation alters conduct. Conduct leaves traces." He leaned back. "The difficulty is that we do not yet know which part of that chain we are seeing." When we returned to Baker Street, Holmes refused dinner, which was always a sign that a case had moved from curiosity to preoccupation. He spread several reproductions of Vale's portraits across the table. Not photographs, the quality would have been inadequate, but charcoal studies and color notes he had made himself during our visit. For nearly an hour he compared them in silence. I eventually abandoned my attempt to read and watched him instead. At last he stopped. "There," he said softly. I rose and crossed to the table. "What have you found?" Holmes pointed to the eyes in 3 different sketches. "Observe the direction of gaze." I studied them carefully. "In this one she looks left, in the next forward, in the third." I paused. "She looks slightly upward." Holmes nodded. "Now compare the lighting." I frowned. The shadows differed subtly from one image to another, but not in any ordinary artistic progression. They don't correspond to a single light source, I said slowly. Exactly. He tapped the third sketch. In this version, the illumination comes from below and slightly to the right. A lamp? Perhaps. He leaned forward. Or a candle held by someone standing near the subject. A silence. Or a candle held by someone standing near the subject. A silence followed. Then Holmes added quietly, someone not visible in the painting. I felt a faint chill. You think another person was present during the sitting? I think another person became part of the composition. A hidden figure? Holmes shook his head. Not hidden. He stood and began pacing. Artists omit things constantly. A chair, a window, a servant crossing the room. The omission itself means nothing. A pause. But repeated omission may mean everything. At that moment there came a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson admitted our original client, the nervous gentleman from Whitechapel. He looked exhausted. Mr. Holmes, he said, it happened again. Holmes did not invite him to elaborate immediately. Instead, he asked, at midnight? And what changed this time? The man swallowed. She was smiling again. A pause, but differently. How? The man's voice lowered. As though she recognized me. Holmes studied him carefully. You remained alone with the portrait? For how long? From 11:45 until shortly after midnight. Holmes nodded once. And during that period did you speak? The question startled him. Speak? To the portrait? The man hesitated. What did you say? He looked embarrassed. I asked who she was. A silence followed. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. Did you touch the canvas? No. Move closer to it? How close? A few inches. Holmes leaned back. After the man departed, I said, You think he influenced the change? Holmes did not answer directly. Watson, when does a portrait become interactive? That is a nonsensical question. Is it? He picked up one of the sketches. A portrait is ordinarily passive. The viewer supplies interpretation. A pause. But what if the interpretation becomes consistent across viewers? You mean suggestion? Possibly. He looked toward the fire. Or reinforce. The word stirred an uncomfortable memory from another case. Holmes noticed. Yes, he said quietly. The principle is similar. A pause. Repeated observation can create stability where none objectively exists. I frowned. You are saying people begin seeing the same thing because they expect to. Sometimes, another pause. But expectation alone does not explain the chronology. He returned to the table. The earliest portrait already contained the reflection. A pause. And Eleanor Ashcroft feared the painting before her death. He fell silent for several moments. Then, almost to himself, which means the effect precedes the witnesses. That night Holmes proposed something I had not expected. We shall observe the portrait ourselves. At midnight? At midnight. Shortly before 11 we arrived again at Vale's studio. The artist appeared uneasy but cooperative. Holmes insisted that all lamps remain exactly as they were. No one was to move the canvas. No one was to approach it unnecessarily. Then he did something curious. He measured the room. Distances from the easel to the windows. From the windows to the stove. From the stove to the door. Finally he marked a spot on the floor with chalk. Stand there, Watson, he said. I obeyed. Now look at the portrait. I did. Describe her expression. Neutral, I said after a moment. Tired, perhaps? He erased the mark and made another a few feet to the left. Now, I moved. The expression changed, not dramatically, but perceptibly. She looks wary, I said. Holmes nodded. He marked a third position. From there the woman seemed almost accusatory. I stared at the canvas. That is extraordinary. No, Holmes replied. Merely competent painting. A pause. But competence can be weaponized. As midnight approached, the atmosphere in the studio tightened almost imperceptibly. Vale sat rigidly near the stove. I remained near the marked position. Holmes stood by the window, watching both the room and the clock reflected faintly in the glass. The minute hand approached 12. Nothing happened. No flicker. No movement. No supernatural transformation. The clock struck midnight. Still nothing. Then Holmes spoke quietly. Now, Mr. Vale. The artist looked up. Tell us the truth. Vale's face went pale. I have told you the truth. No, Holmes said softly. You have told us the mechanism, not the cause. A silence followed. Holmes stepped closer. You knew the portrait changed before our client did. Vale did not answer. You knew because Eleanor Ashcroft told you. Still silence. Holmes continued. "And after her death you continued painting the same face for 7 years." Vale's hands trembled slightly. Holmes's voice remained calm. "That is not grief alone." A pause. "It is surveillance." I stared at him. "Surveillance?" Holmes did not look at me. "You were watching for recurrence." He fixed Vale with a steady gaze. "Because you believed the portrait could predict something." Vale whispered. The single word seemed to empty the room. Holmes asked quietly, "Predict what?" Vale swallowed. A silence followed. I felt my stomach tighten. "Why?" Vale looked at the portrait. "Not everyone's," he said hoarsely. "Only those connected to it." Holmes's expression did not change. Vale closed his eyes briefly. "Eleanor said the woman in the painting changed before accidents." A pause. "At first I dismissed it." Another pause. "But then things began happening." "What things?" Vale opened his eyes. "People around her died." The fire cracked softly. Outside, somewhere beyond the fogged windows, a carriage rattled past. Holmes said very quietly, "And you believed the portrait was warning her?" Vale nodded. A pause. "Until she drowned." Holmes was silent for several seconds. Then he asked the question that shifted the investigation again. "And after Eleanor Ashcroft died?" A pause. "Who died next?" Vale looked at him, and for the first time since we met him genuine fear entered his face. "My brother," he whispered. 2 weeks later." The studio seemed suddenly colder. Holmes turned away slightly, thoughtful, then said, "Watson, do you see the inconsistency?" I hesitated. "No." Holmes looked back at the portrait. "Eleanor feared the painting because she believed it predicted death." A pause. "But prediction is useless unless the event can still be changed." He tapped the edge of the canvas lightly. "Which means someone wanted her afraid." Vale stared at him. "You think this was deliberate?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "I think fear was part of the design." A pause. "And fear rarely appears without an author." He stepped closer to the portrait one final time that night, then said softly, almost to himself, "The expression does not change at midnight." A pause. "The witness changes first." I looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he turned toward Vale. "Tomorrow," he said, "I want the names of every person who saw these paintings before Eleanor's death." A pause. "And every person who died afterward." Vale nodded weakly. Holmes took his coat. As we left the studio, I said quietly, "You have someone in mind?" Holmes glanced toward the foggy street. He adjusted his gloves. "Not yet, Watson?" A pause. "But I believe we have finally found the hand behind the midnight expression. It has often been remarked that Sherlock Holmes appeared most alive when danger approached. I do not mean physical danger alone, though he possessed an undeniable appetite for risk. Rather, I refer to those moments when a case ceased to be a collection of facts and became a living structure whose hidden mechanisms had begun to move. The morning after our midnight vigil at Adrian Vale's studio was one such occasion. Holmes was already awake when I entered the sitting-room at Baker Street. The breakfast tray remained untouched beside him. Several sheets of paper lay spread across the table, covered in names, dates, and observations. He had not slept, or if he had, it could not have been for long. Without looking up, he said, "Good morning, Watson. You have been working all night." Looking up, he said, "Good morning, Watson. You have been working all night." "I have been eliminating the impossible." A pause. "Unfortunately, what remains is becoming increasingly inconvenient." I poured myself coffee. "Have you discovered something?" Holmes tapped one of the pages. Vale delivered the list. "The names?" He handed me a sheet. There were 12 names in total. Individuals who had viewed Eleanor Ashcroft's portrait during the months before her death. Relatives. Household staff. Several names had been marked in red pencil. I counted them. "Why these 6?" Holmes leaned back. "They are dead." A silence followed. I looked again. "Dead?" He nodded. "Within 2 years of Eleanor's drowning." I frowned. "That proves very little." "Indeed." Holmes's expression remained thoughtful. "Until one notices the order." He handed me a second page. This contained dates. Dates of death. Dates of visits. Dates of social gatherings. Dates of exhibitions. I studied them carefully, then slowly looked up. The realization had begun to form. They died in sequence. Holmes nodded. "Precisely." A pause. "Not randomly." I felt a chill. The pattern was unmistakable. The individuals who had seen the portrait seemed to have died in the same order in which they had encountered it. The intervals varied, the causes varied, but the sequence remained intact. Surely that cannot be significant. Holmes lit his pipe. It almost certainly is. A pause. The question is whether it is meaningful. Before I could reply, there came a rapid knock upon the door. Mrs. Hudson entered looking unusually pale. "Inspector Lestrade is here, Mr. Holmes." Holmes immediately rose. "Show him in." Lestrade entered carrying his bowler hat in one hand. His face alone told us something had happened. "Another one?" Holmes's eyes sharpened. Lestrade removed a notebook. Jonathan Mercer. The name meant nothing to me, but Holmes recognized it instantly. One of the names on the list. For several seconds no one spoke. Then Holmes asked quietly, "When?" "Last night." Lestrade swallowed. 1 minute past midnight. The room fell silent. I felt my pulse quicken. Holmes, however, remained perfectly composed. "Cause of death? Fall from a staircase." Lestrade looked uncomfortable. Witnesses claim he appeared frightened. Holmes took the notebook. "Where?" "Bloomsbury." A pause. "And before you ask, yes." Lestrade sighed. He saw the portrait. For the first time since entering, Holmes appeared genuinely interested, not surprised, as though a predicted result had finally been confirmed. "What was Mercer doing before midnight?" Holmes asked. Lestrade consulted his notes. He was alone. Completely. No visitors. No servants. They had retired. Holmes nodded slowly, and yet something frightened him. Lestrade spread his hands. "You tell me." Within the hour we were traveling toward Bloomsbury. The victim's house stood upon a quiet street lined with respectable Georgian residences. Mercer's study occupied the upper floor. It was there his body had been found. The room itself offered little at first glance. A writing desk, a fireplace, a clock. Holmes examined each in turn, then stopped before the clock. It had fallen from the mantel during the incident. The hands remained fixed. January 12th. "A coincidence?" I suggested. Holmes did not answer. Instead he examined the desk. Several papers lay scattered there. One had been written shortly before death. The ink remained fresh enough to preserve the pressure of the pen. Holmes read it silently, then handed it to me. The note contained only one sentence. "She is looking at me now." Good heavens! Lestrade muttered something under his breath. Holmes remained thoughtful, very thoughtful. "He owned a reproduction," Holmes said quietly. Lestrade blinked. "A reproduction of what?" "The portrait." The inspector frowned. "How do you know?" Holmes pointed toward a rectangular patch upon the wall. Dust surrounded it. A clean space remained in the center. Something had hung there recently. "Where is it now?" Holmes asked. Lestrade hesitated. "We couldn't find it." A pause. "It disappeared." That statement would have sounded absurd under ordinary circumstances. Yet after the events of the past several days, none of us dismissed it immediately. Holmes spent nearly an hour examining the room. When at last he finished, we returned to Baker Street. The entire journey passed in silence, not because Holmes lacked ideas, but because he had too many. I recognized the signs. His mind was assembling pieces that had not yet revealed their final arrangement. That evening he announced something unexpected. "We shall conduct an experiment." I looked up from my chair. "With the portrait?" I frowned. "What sort of experiment?" Holmes moved toward the fireplace. "A simple one." A pause. "I intend to become a witness." The words unsettled me immediately. "You mean observe the portrait yourself?" "Precisely." I stared at him. "That seems unnecessarily dangerous." Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Watson." A pause. "If a phenomenon exists, it must be observed. And if observation is the phenomenon—" His smile widened slightly. "Then we shall learn even more." Shortly before midnight we returned once again to Vale's studio. This time Holmes made several unusual preparations. He positioned mirrors around the room, measured angles, recorded distances, and finally placed a chair directly before the portrait. "Sit there?" I asked. "No." He removed his coat. "I shall." The clock approached 12. The atmosphere felt oppressive, not because of anything visible, but because expectation itself had become part of the experiment. We all felt it. Myself, even Holmes, though he alone appeared untroubled by it. 5 minutes to midnight. Holmes sat motionless before the portrait. 3 minutes. The clock began to strike. 12. Nothing happened. The portrait remained unchanged. The room remained silent. The mirrors reflected only what they always had. A knock. Every person in the studio turned simultaneously. The sound had come from the main door below. One sharp knock, then another. Holmes stood immediately. "What time?" I checked my watch. 1 minute past midnight. The knock came again. Measured. Deliberate. Vale's face had gone pale. "There shouldn't be anyone here." Holmes crossed the room. "Stay where you are." We followed him downstairs. The knocking continued, 3 times, then silence. Holmes opened the door. No one stood outside, only the empty street, fog drifting beneath the gas lamps. No footsteps, no carriage, no visitor, nothing. Yet upon the threshold lay a single object, a folded piece of paper. Holmes picked it up carefully, opened it, and for the first time in the entire investigation, Sherlock Holmes looked genuinely surprised. "What is it?" I asked. He handed me the note. I read the words, and felt a cold sensation settle in my chest, because the message contained only a single sentence, a sentence written in a hand neither Vale nor our client could have produced, a sentence apparently addressed to Holmes himself. "The next portrait will be yours." The fog drifted silently through the street beyond. Holmes folded the note. His eyes had become very bright, very focused, the look of a hunter who has finally realized the quarry knows he is being followed. "Excellent," he said softly. I stared at him. Holmes slipped the paper into his pocket. "At last." A pause. "We have moved beyond fear." Another pause. "And into communication." But as we climbed the stairs back toward the studio, I could not shake the uneasy feeling that somewhere in London someone had just made a fatal mistake. For Sherlock Holmes was never more dangerous than when a mystery chose to speak first. There are moments in an investigation when one ceases to pursue the mystery and instead becomes pursued by it. The anonymous note left upon the threshold of Adrian Vale's studio marked precisely such a moment. "The next portrait will be yours." The words themselves were simple enough. Yet what disturbed me was not their content, but Holmes's reaction to them. He was pleased. Not outwardly jubilant, certainly. Sherlock Holmes never indulged in such displays. Yet I knew him too well to mistake the faint sharpening of his eyes, the increased energy in his movements, the almost imperceptible quickening of thought that accompanied the arrival of a worthy adversary. The note had accomplished something that weeks of mystery had not. It had become personal. The following morning I awoke to discover that Holmes had already vanished. This in itself was not unusual. What was unusual was the condition of Baker Street. The sitting room resembled the aftermath of an academic hurricane. Books lay open across chairs. Maps covered the table. Newspaper clippings were pinned to the wall beside chemical formulas, sketches of the portraits, timelines of deaths, and lists of names connected to Eleanor Ashcroft. At the center of this chaos stood a single sheet of paper. Upon it Holmes had written 3 words, not the portrait. I stared at the note for several moments, then sat down and examined the surrounding materials. For nearly an hour I attempted to follow his reasoning. Eventually I realized what troubled him. Every assumption thus far had centered upon the paintings, the changing expressions, the midnight transformations, the sequence of death, the anonymous warning. Everything seemed to revolve around the portrait, and Holmes had apparently concluded that this was precisely the mistake. It was nearly noon before he returned. His coat was damp from rain, and his boots carried traces of mud. He appeared invigorated. "Ah, Watson, you have been busy." "Exceptionally." He removed his gloves. "And I have finally found our common factor." I immediately set aside my newspaper. The connection between the victims? Holmes poured himself coffee. "And it is not what I expected." He sat opposite me. "For 2 days I have examined every person connected to Eleanor Ashcroft. A pause. The dead, the living, the artist, the servants, the acquaintances. And?" Holmes's expression became thoughtful. "They all possessed one characteristic." I waited. He smiled faintly. "None of them were related by blood." That surprised me. "What significance does that have?" "None whatsoever." I sighed. "Holmes, Patience Watson." He leaned forward. "They were not related by blood." A pause. "But they were related by observation." I frowned. "Observation?" Holmes nodded. "Each individual spent an unusual amount of time studying people." He began counting on his fingers. Eleanor Ashcroft kept detailed journals. A finger. Jonathan Mercer was a biographer. Another. 2 victims were portrait patrons. Another. One was a theater critic. Another, and another taught anatomy. The pattern was strange, not obvious, yet undeniable. They all observed others professionally. Precisely. Holmes rose and began pacing. "At first I believed the portrait linked the victims." A pause. Now I believe the victims linked the portrait. The statement left me no less confused. Before I could press him further, there came another knock. This time it was Lestrade. And from the moment he entered, I knew he brought unwelcome news. Another death. Holmes nodded calmly. I expected as much. Lestrade frowned. I wish you'd stop doing that. Doing what? Predicting corpses. Holmes gestured toward a chair. Lestrade consulted his notebook. Professor Edwin Hartwell. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, then nodded. As expected, the inspector stared. You know him? Not personally. A pause. But he was on the list. Lestrade looked irritated. That list is beginning to concern me. He sat heavily. This makes 8. A silence followed. Holmes finally asked, Time of death? Shortly after midnight. Of course. Lestrade continued. The strange part is midnight. Of course. Lestrade continued. The strange part is how he died. Go on. He apparently collapsed while examining a painting. I exchanged a glance with Holmes. The inspector noticed. That's not all. He opened his notebook again. We found a statement written in his diary. Holmes held out his hand. Lestrade passed him the page. Holmes read, then handed it to me. The entry had been written scarcely an hour before death. Its final line read, The face is becoming familiar. A chill passed through me. The same pattern. The same growing obsession. The same sense of recognition. Holmes stood abruptly. Lestrade groaned. There you go again. But Holmes was already reaching for his coat. Watson. Yes, we are going to the National Gallery. The journey was undertaken immediately. As we rode through London, I finally demanded an explanation. Why the National Gallery? Holmes gazed through the cab window. Because I wished to meet a collector. The answer made little sense. Yet by now I had long abandoned any expectation that Holmes's explanations would arrive before their proper time. The collector proved to be a man named Sebastian Crowe. His name had appeared repeatedly throughout Holmes's research. Art patron, financier, occasional sponsor of exhibitions, and one of the earliest owners of Adrian Vale's work. Crowe received us in a lavish townhouse filled almost entirely with portraits. Portraits lined every wall. Aristocrats, merchants, soldiers, hundreds of painted faces. The effect was unsettling. One felt watched, not by any individual painting, but by the collection itself. Holmes moved slowly through the room, studying each canvas. At last he stopped. Extraordinary, Crowe smiled. You appreciate art, Mr. Holmes? Holmes ignored the question. Instead he asked, How many portraits do you own? Crowe seemed pleased. Approximately 400. Holmes nodded. And how many depict people who are now dead? The smile faded. Only slightly, but enough. Most of them, Crowe admitted. Holmes was silent. And do you ever feel they change? The room became very still. Crowe stared at him. For several seconds neither man spoke. Finally the collector said, That is an unusual question. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Not unusual enough. Crowe smiled again. But this time the smile appeared forced. I cannot say that I have observed any such phenomenon. Holmes nodded. Of course. A pause. Because you do not study the paintings. Crowe blinked. What? Holmes gestured around the room. You collect faces. A pause. But you never look at them. The words struck with surprising force. Crowe's expression tightened. For the first time, genuine discomfort appeared. Holmes turned toward the door. Thank you for your time. We departed. Only when we had reached the street did I speak. Well? Holmes lit his pipe, then smiled. My dear Watson. A pause. I believe we have finally met our first genuine suspect. Sebastian Crowe. Holmes nodded. Possibly. A pause. Or possibly the man he is protecting. The fog thickened around us. Gas lamps glowed dimly in the gathering evening, and as we walked back toward Baker Street I found myself increasingly troubled, not merely by the deaths, not merely by the portraits, but by Holmes himself, for during the entire interview he had not once asked whether Crowe knew Eleanor Ashcroft. He had not asked about Adrian Vale. He had not asked about the midnight changes. Instead, he had studied Crowe exactly as one might study a portrait, as though the answer no longer lay in the paintings at all, but in the people who chose to look at them. I have often remarked that one of the most exasperating qualities possessed by Sherlock Holmes was his tendency to withhold information precisely when that information would have been most useful. There were occasions when such secrecy could be justified. There were others when it seemed designed solely to test the patience of his friends. The events following our visit to Sebastian Crow belonged firmly to the latter category. For the next 3 days Holmes vanished. Not entirely, of course. He appeared briefly at Baker Street during odd hours, usually to retrieve some object, consult a reference, or scribble a note before disappearing once more into the labyrinth of London. Yet whenever I attempted to question him regarding the case, he became infuriatingly evasive. "Later, Watson." "Not yet." Or, most irritating of all, "The answer would mean less before the question is complete." By the second day my patience had begun to fray. By the third I was considering the possibility of physically preventing his departure until he explained himself. Fortunately for our friendship, events intervened. It was shortly after 11 in the morning when a telegram arrived. The message contained only 6 words: "Come to Blackthorn Street, alone." The address was unfamiliar. Located in a neglected district south of the river, it consisted of warehouses, workshops, and narrow streets that seemed perpetually trapped between industry and abandonment. I arrived shortly after noon. The rain had returned, not heavily, just enough to make the city appear older. A man sat upon a bench near the entrance to a shuttered warehouse. He was elderly, dressed in worn clothing. His beard was gray and untidy. His shoulders stooped with age. At first I paid him little attention. Then he spoke. "You're late, Watson." I stopped instantly. The voice was unmistakable. "Holmes?" The old man smiled. Or rather, Holmes smiled through the old man's face. I confess that even after years of acquaintance, his mastery of disguise continued to astonish me. Not merely the cosmetics, not merely the clothing, but the transformation of posture, expression, and movement. He had become another person entirely. "Good heavens," I said. Holmes rose slowly, maintaining the illusion. "Effective?" "Extraordinarily." He nodded with satisfaction. Then his expression became serious. The warehouse appeared deserted. Yet once inside, I immediately realized this was misleading. Voices drifted from deeper within the building. Measured, cultured voices. Holmes led me toward a narrow viewing position behind stacked crates. From there we could observe the main chamber without being seen. What I witnessed surprised me. Approximately 20 individuals occupied the room, men and women of obvious education and means, lawyers, professors, writers. Several faces I recognized from newspapers. At the center stood Sebastian Crow. "So," I whispered, "a meeting." Holmes nodded. "Watch!" Crow began speaking. His audience listened attentively. What followed was not a lecture, nor a social gathering. It resembled something stranger, almost ceremonial. Upon an easel stood a portrait, covered by cloth. Crow addressed the assembly. "Ladies and gentlemen, our purpose remains unchanged." A pause. "We observe." A murmur of agreement followed. Crow continued. "The image reveals itself only through persistence." I glanced toward Holmes. His eyes remained fixed upon the speaker. Another member rose, an elderly professor. "The sequence continues?" Crow nodded. A pause. "And we are approaching completion." The room fell silent. I whispered, "What are they talking about?" Holmes answered without looking at me. "The real subject of the investigation." Crow approached the covered portrait, then slowly removed the cloth. I felt a jolt of recognition. It was Eleanor Ashcroft, not one of Vale's known paintings. A different portrait, older, more detailed, and somehow more unsettling. The room watched in complete silence. For nearly a minute no one spoke. Then a woman near the front whispered, "Her expression has changed." Several others nodded. I looked carefully. The painting appeared ordinary, yet the observers behaved as though witnessing movement. Suddenly I understood. "They all believe it." Holmes nodded faintly. "Yes." A pause. Then he added, "Which makes them dangerous." The meeting continued. Over the next hour we learned much, though not in the manner I expected. No one discussed murder. No one discussed conspiracy. No one discussed supernatural phenomena. Instead, they discussed observation, memory, and always the portrait, always Eleanor Ashcroft. Eventually Crow spoke a name I had not heard before. "Doctor." The reaction within the room was immediate. Several members shifted uneasily. One crossed himself, another looked away. Holmes became absolutely still. "Who is March?" I whispered. For the first time that day, Holmes appeared genuinely interested. "The man I have been searching for." The meeting concluded shortly afterward. Members departed individually. Crow remained behind. Holmes waited, then followed him. For nearly an hour we shadowed the collector through the streets of London. Eventually he arrived at a large house near Kensington, an elegant residence, private, quiet, respectable. Holmes stopped across the street. "That," he said softly, "is where the trail ends. And Dr. March lives there?" Holmes nodded. "Who is he?" A long silence followed. Then Holmes spoke. "7 years ago, Gideon March was one of the foremost psychologists in England. A pausa. An expert in perception." I frowned. "What happened?" Holmes's expression darkened. "He vanished." The answer surprised me. "Vanished?" "Officially, he retired." A pausa. "Unofficially?" He looked toward the house. "He conducted an experiment." The fog drifted across the street between us and the residence. For several moments neither of us spoke. Finally I asked, "What sort of experiment?" Holmes's eyes remained fixed upon the darkened windows. "The kind that ruins lives." A silence followed. Then he added quietly, "And I believe Eleanor Ashcroft was its first victim." As we turned away from the house I realized something unsettling. Throughout the entire investigation we had assumed the portrait concealed a secret. But perhaps we had misunderstood. Perhaps the portrait was not hiding the secret. Perhaps it was the secret. And somewhere behind those darkened Kensington windows lived a man who had spent 7 years ensuring that no one understood why. The morning following our surveillance of Sebastian Crow's gathering marked a turning point in the case. For the first time since Eleanor Ashcroft's portrait had entered our lives, Sherlock Holmes began to share fragments of his reasoning. Not conclusions, never conclusions, but enough pieces that I could finally glimpse the outline of the structure he had been building in secret. And it was a structure more disturbing than anything I had imagined. A dense fog had settled over Baker Street. The windows of our sitting room were pale with condensation, and the city beyond seemed reduced to shadows moving within shadows. Holmes stood before the fireplace. Upon the table behind him lay every document connected to the case. The portraits, the death records, the diaries, the witness statements, the anonymous note, the timeline. Everything. Without preamble, Holmes spoke. "Watson." "Yes? What is the most dangerous force in human life?" "Greed." He shook his head. "Commun. Ambition." "No." "Predictable." He turned toward me. I frowned. "Expectation?" Holmes nodded. "A man who expects betrayal interprets friendship differently." A pause. "A man who expects disaster notices danger differently." Another pause. "And a man who expects death," his eyes narrowed slightly, "may begin walking toward it." The words lingered in the room. "You believe someone manipulated expectations?" Holmes nodded. "Not merely manipulated." A pause. "Engineered?" He picked up one of Eleanor Ashcroft's diary extracts. 7 years ago, Gideon March became fascinated by a particular question. "What question?" Holmes placed the diary down. "Can an idea kill?" Silence followed. At length I said, "That sounds absurd." "Does it?" Holmes moved toward the window. "If a man convinces another that a harmless object is poisonous, can fear produce illness? Possibly. If a doctor tells a healthy patient that death is imminent, might behavior change? Of course." Holmes nodded. "Then the principle already exists." A pause. "March merely wished to discover its limits." I felt a growing unease. "You think he used Eleanor Ashcroft as an experiment?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead he said, "I think Eleanor Ashcroft discovered she was an experiment." The distinction chilled me more than the original statement. Before I could question him further, the front door burst open downstairs. Rapid footsteps followed. Then Mrs. Hudson appeared, breathless. "Miss Holmes." Holmes turned instantly. "What is it?" "That artist gentleman." "Vale?" She nodded. "He's gone." The room became very still. Mrs. Hudson swallowed. "A messenger arrived 10 minutes ago." A pause. "He hasn't been seen since midnight." Holmes moved immediately. Within 15 minutes we were traveling toward Whitechapel. The journey passed largely in silence. I could almost feel Holmes's mind accelerating, not because Vale's disappearance surprised him, but because it arrived at exactly the wrong moment, or perhaps exactly the right one. The studio stood open when we arrived. That alone was unusual. Vale guarded his work obsessively. Inside, disorder greeted us. Not violent disorder, not a struggle, something stranger. Canvases had been moved, papers scattered, drawers opened, yet valuables remained untouched. Holmes examined the scene carefully, then stopped near the central easel. A note rested there, one line only. She finally looked away. I felt a chill. Holmes read the message twice, then folded it. I sighed. Holmes, there are times when that word becomes infuriating. A faint smile touched his lips. Quite. He moved deeper into the studio. Several minutes later he discovered something beneath a stack of sketches. A ledger. Vale's personal notebook. Holmes opened it immediately. For nearly 10 minutes he read without speaking. Then his expression changed, not dramatically, but enough, the way a lock changes when the correct key finally enters. What is it? I asked. Holmes handed me the book. I examined several pages. At first they seemed incomprehensible. Datus. Observations. Then a pattern emerged. Each entry described someone viewing the portrait. Their reactions, their comments, their emotional responses, and beside every name, a prediction. Good heavens! Holmes nodded. Exactly. One entry read, Mr. Mercer notices sadness, increasing fixation likely. Another, Professor Hartwell seeks pattern recognition, high susceptibility. Another, Mrs. Dunbar already fearful, progress expected. The notebook continued for years, each subject analyzed, measured, categorized. Like specimens, I looked up slowly. These aren't artistic notes. Holmes's eyes hardened. No. A pause. They are research notes. Silence followed. At last I whispered, Gideon March. Holmes nodded. The name hung heavily between us. For 7 years we had been pursuing a mystery involving portraits. Yet the notebook suggested something profoundly different. The paintings were not the experiment. The viewers were. Holmes spoke quietly. March was studying expectation. A pause. He wished to know whether belief could create inevitability. And could it? Holmes's expression darkened. I believe he thought so. A long silence followed. Then Holmes said something unexpected. Watson. Yes? I owe you an apology. That alone was remarkable. For what? He closed the notebook. I have concealed a crucial fact. What fact? Holmes hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from reluctance. I have already met Gideon March. The room seemed to stop. What? Holmes nodded. 3 days ago. I could scarcely believe it. You found him? And you didn't tell me. No. Why? Holmes looked toward the portrait. Because I needed to know whether he recognized me. A pause. Did he? Holmes smiled grimly. Immediately. Silence followed. What happened? Holmes's gaze remained fixed upon the canvas. He invited me to participate. The words unsettled me instantly. Participate in what? Holmes's expression became very cold. The final phase. Outside, somewhere beyond the fogged windows, a church bell struck the hour. The sound seemed distant, muted, almost unreal. I suddenly understood something. For weeks we had believed ourselves investigators, observers, men standing safely outside the mystery. But that was no longer true. Gideon March knew Holmes was coming. He had anticipated every step, perhaps even encouraged them. And now Adrian Vale had vanished. The artist who had spent 7 years recording the experiment was gone, either as a victim or as a participant. Holmes slipped the notebook into his coat, then turned toward the door. Call me, Watson. Where are we going? His eyes were very bright now, very focused. To Kensington. A pause. Because Dr. March has... To Kensington. A pause. Because Dr. March has finally invited us inside. And for the first time since the case began, I felt the unmistakable sensation that the mystery was nearing its center. Not its solution, its center. The dark place around which every death, every portrait, every midnight change had revolved from the beginning. I have known Sherlock Holmes in many moods. I have seen him amused. I have seen him bored. I have seen him triumphant, furious, melancholy, and, on rare occasions, genuinely moved. Yet there existed one particular expression which appeared only when he approached a dangerous intellect. It was not excitement, nor anxiety. Rather, it was a heightened concentration so complete that the ordinary world seemed to fade around him. Such was his appearance as our cab rolled through Kensington toward the residence of Dr. Gideon March. The fog had returned. It seemed impossible to escape it. London itself appeared wrapped within a grey veil, as though the city were reluctant to reveal what lay hidden beneath its surface. Holmes sat opposite me in silence. The notebook recovered from Adrian Vale's studio rested within his coat pocket. The evidence it contained had transformed the case. No longer were we dealing merely with unexplained deaths. We were confronting an experiment, a systematic study, a deliberate manipulation of human belief, and somewhere ahead waited the man responsible. The house stood exactly as we had last seen it, large, elegant, respectable. Nothing about its appearance suggested danger. Indeed, it possessed the reassuring dignity of a successful physician's residence. Only Holmes seemed entirely unimpressed. "Appearances," he remarked quietly as we approached the front door, "are rarely more deceptive than when they are respectable." Before we could knock, the door opened. A servant stood waiting. "Miss Holmes." The man spoke not as a question but as a certainty. "Dr. March is expecting you?" Holmes nodded. I assumed as much. We were shown inside. The interior surprised me. Rather than the clinical atmosphere I had expected, the house resembled a private library. Books filled every wall. Hundreds, perhaps thousands. Psychology, medicine, philosophy, mathematics, anthropology. Subjects from every conceivable discipline. Yet one feature dominated the room. Not dozens, hundreds. Every corridor, every staircase, every wall. Faces stared from every direction. Strangers, the dead, the living. I felt the same discomfort that had accompanied our visit to Sebastian Crowe's collection, only stronger, far stronger. Holmes noticed my expression. "Observe carefully, Watson." I did. And gradually something became apparent. The portrait shared a peculiar quality. Each subject appeared to be looking not at the artist, but at someone standing just beyond the canvas, as though watching, waiting, observing. A door opened. The man who entered was neither imposing nor theatrical. Indeed, Dr. Gideon March appeared surprisingly ordinary. Perhaps 60 years of age, gray-haired, immaculately dressed, the sort of gentleman one might overlook entirely. Only his eyes distinguished him. They were extraordinarily attentive, not intelligent alone. Many intelligent men possess distracted eyes. These were different, predatory. He smiled warmly. "Miss Holmes." His voice carried genuine pleasure. "I am delighted you accepted my invitation." Holmes removed his gloves. "You threaten me." March smiled again. "A threat implies hostility." A pause. "I assure you I have nothing but admiration." The two men regarded one another quietly, and for the first time I understood what Holmes had sensed. March was dangerous not because he was violent, but because he observed human beings the way a naturalist observes insects, as specimens. "Dr. Watson," March said, "I have read your accounts." I nodded cautiously. "Thank you." He gestured toward chairs. "Please sit." Holmes remained standing. "I prefer answers." March laughed softly. "Naturally." A pause. "And which answer would you like first?" Holmes's gaze hardened. "Eleanor Ashcroft." The room became still. March studied him for several moments, then nodded. "Very well." He walked toward a portrait hanging above the fire. "Very well." He walked toward a portrait hanging above the fireplace. It depicted Eleanor, younger than in Vale's paintings. Confident. March looked up at the image. She was remarkable. A pause. "Far more remarkable than she realized." Holmes said nothing. March continued. "She volunteered." The statement stunned me. "Volunteered?" March nodded. "Entirely." He turned toward us. "She became fascinated by my research." A pause. "She wished to participate." Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "What research?" March smiled faintly. "The relationship between expectation and perception." Of course. The same phrase appeared repeatedly throughout the investigation. March continued. "Most people imagine they see reality." A pause. "They do not." He folded his hands. "They see predictions." Holmes remained silent, allowing the man to speak. Every moment, March continued, the mind constructs expectations. A pause. "It predicts danger." Another pause. "It predicts safety." Another. "It predicts behavior." He smiled. "Then mistakes those predictions for reality." I felt uneasy, not because the theory sounded absurd, but because it sounded plausible. March moved slowly through the room. My experiment sought a simple answer. A pause. "If expectation becomes sufficiently powerful," he looked directly at Holmes, "can it shape destiny?" Silence followed. At last Holmes spoke. "And your answer?" March's smile vanished. The word hung heavily in the air. Holmes remained unmoved. "You manipulated those people." March nodded calmly. "Certainly." "You convinced them the portrait predicted death." "Not immediately." A pause. "I allowed them to convince themselves." That statement angered me. People died. March looked toward me. His expression held neither guilt nor pride, only certainty. "People always die, Doctor." I rose abruptly. "That is monstrous." March's eyes returned to Holmes. "An emotional objection." Holmes's voice became very cold. "A correct objection." For the first time something flickered across March's face. "Respect. Precisely why I wished to meet you." He approached a desk, opened a drawer, removed a file, then handed it to Holmes. "What is this?" Holmes asked. "My final experiment." A pause. "The one Eleanor discovered." The room seemed to contract. Holmes opened the file. For several moments he read silently. Then his expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to alarm me. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward March. "You never intended to study death." March smiled. "No." A pause. "I intended to create certainty." Holmes closed the file, and Eleanor realized it. The smile disappeared entirely. She understood before anyone else. A long silence followed. Then Holmes asked the question that mattered most. "How did she die?" For the first time since our arrival, Gideon March hesitated. Only briefly, but enough. "Accidentally." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You are lying." The room became utterly silent. Even March stopped moving. Seconds passed. Then Holmes spoke again. Very softly. "Eleanor Ashcroft did not drown because of your experiment." A pause. "She drowned because she threatened to expose it." March's face revealed nothing. Yet in that moment I knew Holmes had struck the truth. The silence that followed was answer enough. Holmes slipped the file into his coat, then turned toward the door. "We are finished here?" March did not attempt to stop him. Instead he said something that caused Holmes to pause. "Not quite." A pause. "Adrian Vale is still alive." I stopped instantly. Holmes turned. "Where?" March smiled faintly. "That depends." A pause. "How much have you really understood?" And as we left the house, carrying with us the first genuine proof of conspiracy, I realized the case had entered its final and most dangerous stage. Because Gideon March had finally revealed his true motive. Not prediction, not death, not fear. The control of belief itself. There are certain investigations which conclude not with discovery but with demonstration. The truth may already be known to the investigator. The chain of logic may already be complete. Yet knowledge alone is insufficient. The criminal must be confronted. The deception must be exposed. The illusion must be broken before witnesses. Only then does a mystery truly end. It was during the 48 hours following our visit to Dr. Gideon March that Sherlock Holmes completed the final stage of his design. And, as was often the case, he revealed almost none of it to me. We returned to Baker Street shortly after dusk. The fog still haunted the city. Gas lamps burned like distant stars beyond the window panes. Holmes removed the file he had taken from March's desk and spread its contents across the table. I moved closer. For several minutes we examined the papers together. What we found proved extraordinary. The documents contained years of research, observations, psychological studies, correspondence, experimental notes, records of interviews, predictions, assessments. Most disturbing of all were the classifications. Each participant in March's experiment had been assigned a category. Highly suggestible, moderately resistant, emotionally vulnerable, pattern-seeking, likely to internalize prediction. Human beings reduced to variables. Holmes read silently for some time, then placed one particular sheet aside. "What is that?" "A mistake." I frowned. "A mistake by whom?" Holmes's eyes hardened. "By the murderer." The answer startled me. Murderer? Until that moment, despite all that had occurred, the case had remained clouded by uncertainty. Manipulation, certainly. Conspiracy, undoubtedly. Yet direct murder still rested largely upon suspicion. Now Holmes spoke as though doubt no longer existed. "You know who killed Eleanor Ashcroft?" It was not a question. Holmes nodded. "Yes." My pulse quickened. "March?" To my surprise, Holmes shook his head. "No." For several seconds I simply stared at him. If not March, then who? Holmes lit his pipe. The familiar ritual bought him time, or perhaps allowed him to arrange his thoughts. Finally he said, "March created the experiment." A pause. "Another person protected it." Another pause. "And when Eleanor threatened exposure, that person acted." The room seemed suddenly smaller. Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Watson." A pause. "If I tell you now, your face may betray us later." I confess I uttered a remark not suitable for publication. Holmes merely laughed. "Your frustration is entirely justified. Then he rose. "Where?" "We have invitations to deliver." Thus began one of the strangest days of my association with Sherlock Holmes. From morning until evening we travelled across London, visiting houses, sending telegrams, meeting individuals connected to the case, surviving participants, witnesses, former associates of Eleanor Ashcroft, even Inspector Lestrade. To each person Holmes delivered essentially the same message: be present tomorrow night. No further explanation. No details, only a location, Adrian Vale's studio, midnight. By the end of the day my curiosity had become unbearable. At last, as we returned to Baker Street, I demanded answers. "Holmes." "Yes?" "What exactly are we doing?" He removed his coat. "We are constructing a stage." "A stage?" "Certainly." A pause. "For 7 years someone has controlled perception." He placed the file upon the table. "Tomorrow night perception shall be controlled by me." The statement carried a quiet confidence I had learned never to underestimate. Yet something troubled me. What about Adrian Vale? Holmes became thoughtful. "That is the one uncertainty." "The one uncertainty?" He nodded. "Alive or dead, he remains essential." The answer did little to reassure me. The following evening arrived beneath a sky heavy with rain. By 11 o'clock, guests had begun arriving at the studio. The atmosphere felt almost theatrical. Sebastian Crowe appeared first. Then several members of the secret gathering we had observed. Lestrade arrived shortly afterward, accompanied by 2 plainclothes officers. Finally, to my surprise, Dr. Gideon March himself entered. He seemed entirely calm. Indeed, he appeared amused. "Miss Holmes." Holmes inclined his head. "Doctor." No further greeting passed between them. The room slowly filled. Observers, witnesses, participants, people whose lives had been touched by Eleanor Ashcroft's portrait. At precisely 11:55, Holmes closed the studio doors. The room fell silent. Everyone sensed something approaching. The portrait stood at the center of the studio, illuminated by a single lamp. Its expression appeared neutral, waiting. Holmes stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen." His voice carried effortlessly through the room. "For 7 years many of you have believed that this painting possesses unusual properties." Several faces shifted uneasily. "You believed it changed." A pause. "You believed it predicted death." Another pause. "Some of you still believe it." No one spoke. Holmes nodded. He gestured toward the portrait. "Then watch carefully." The clock approached midnight. Tension thickened. Even I felt it, despite everything Holmes had explained, despite logic, despite reason. Part of me still expected the impossible. The final minute began. The room remained utterly silent. Midnight struck. 12 clear chimes, every eye fixed upon the portrait. Nothing happened. 5 seconds. Still nothing. A murmur spread through the room. Then Holmes spoke. "Precisely." He turned toward the assembled guests. "The portrait does not change." Confusion followed. Several individuals exchanged glances. Crowe frowned. March remained motionless. Holmes continued. "It never changed." The room erupted. Protests, questions, disbelief. Holmes raised one hand. Silence returned. "It appears to change because expectation changes." A pause. "You are shown an image." Another pause. "You are told to observe it repeatedly." Another. "You begin searching for difference." His gaze swept the room. "And eventually you create it." March smiled faintly, almost proudly. Holmes noticed, and smiled in return. Then he delivered the blow, which is exactly what Dr. March intended. The room froze. All eyes turned toward the psychologist. March did not deny it. Instead, he nodded. "An impressive explanation." Holmes's expression hardened. "It is not the explanation." A pause. "It is merely the bait." For the first time, uncertainty appeared in March's eyes. Only briefly. But I saw it. Holmes stepped toward the portrait, then reached behind the frame, and removed something, a folded document. Gasps echoed through the room. Lestrade stepped forward. "What is that?" Holmes unfolded the paper carefully, then looked directly across the room, not at March, at someone else, someone standing near the rear wall, someone whose face suddenly lost all color. Holmes raised the document, and said quietly, "Eleanor Ashcroft hid this here on the night before she died." The studio became utterly silent. The trap had closed, and for the first time the true murderer realized there was no escape. There are few moments in life as extraordinary as the instant when confusion becomes understanding. A mystery may occupy months. It may generate hundreds of theories. It may seem impossible. Then, suddenly, a single fact falls into place, and the entire structure reveals itself. Such was the atmosphere inside Adrian Vale's studio as Sherlock Holmes held aloft the folded document hidden behind Eleanor Ashcroft's portrait. Every eye in the room remained fixed upon him. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the rain against the windows seemed to fade into silence. For 7 years the portrait had inspired fear, obsession, speculation, and death. Now, at last, it was about to speak. Holmes unfolded the paper carefully. The document had yellowed with age. Its edges were brittle. Yet the writing remained perfectly legible. He glanced briefly at the contents, then looked toward the rear of the room, toward the individual whose composure had vanished the moment the document appeared, Sebastian Crowe. The collector's face had become pale, not shocked, terrified, and in that instant I knew. Before Holmes uttered a word, before Lestrade reacted, before the evidence was presented, Holmes folded the paper once more. "Mr. Crowe," the collector said nothing. "Would you care to explain why Eleanor Ashcroft concealed this letter?" Lestrade stepped forward. "Answer him." Crowe's eyes moved toward the door, then toward the officers, then back to Holmes. The calculation lasted only a second. He understood. There was nowhere to go. Holmes nodded slowly. "As I expected." A pause. "Very well." He turned toward the assembled witnesses. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried clearly through the room, "for 7 years you have been encouraged to believe that this portrait possesses extraordinary powers. A pause. It does not." Several faces lowered. Others appeared embarrassed. Holmes continued. "The painting never predicted death." Another pause. "It never changed at midnight." Another. "It never possessed any supernatural quality whatsoever." He glanced toward Dr. Gideon March. What it possessed was something far more dangerous. A silence followed. The ability to influence expectation. March smiled faintly, not denying the charge, almost admiring it. Holmes nodded. Dr. March devoted years to studying perception. A pause. "He wished to determine whether belief could alter behavior." Another pause. "Whether expectation could become destiny." The psychologist remained silent. Holmes continued. To conduct this research he required subjects. His gaze moved toward Eleanor's portrait. Eleanor Ashcroft volunteered. Murmurs spread through the room. Holmes raised a hand. At first the experiment appeared harmless. A pause. Participants observed the portrait. Another pause. They discussed it. Another. They searched for changes. He smiled faintly. And eventually they found them. A few uncomfortable expressions appeared among the guests. Holmes noticed, not because the portrait changed, a pause, but because the observers did. March nodded slowly. Precisely. The single word carried no remorse, only intellectual satisfaction. Holmes turned toward him. "And therein lies the difference between science and obsession." For the first time March looked away. Holmes returned his attention to the room. The experiment expanded. A pause. Participants began anticipating change. Another. Then anticipating danger. Another. Then anticipating danger. Another. Then anticipating death. The room remained silent. No one wished to interrupt. The logic had become unavoidable. Fear altered decisions. Holmes continued. Fear altered habits. Another pause. Fear altered judgment. He glanced toward the empty space where Adrian Vale ordinarily stood. And eventually fear altered lives. A long silence followed. Then Holmes raised the hidden document. Everything might have continued indefinitely. A pause. Except Eleanor Ashcroft discovered something. Crowe lowered his head. Holmes saw it, and continued. She discovered that the experiment was no longer observation. Another pause. It had become manipulation. March's expression tightened slightly. Not disagreement. Recognition. Holmes nodded. She intended to expose it. The room remained utterly still. Then Holmes unfolded the document. "Eleanor's letter explains everything." He began reading. "If this message is found, then I have failed." The words echoed through the studio. "Dr. March believes belief can shape behavior." A pause. "Mr. Crowe believes belief can shape people." The collector closed his eyes. Holmes continued. "The doctor seeks knowledge. Mr. Crowe seeks control." A silence followed. "I no longer trust him. If anything happens to me, investigate the boathouse. He knows what occurred there." The reading ended. No one spoke. The meaning required no explanation. Yet Holmes provided one. As Eleanor grew uncomfortable with the experiment, she threatened exposure. A pause. Dr. March wished to preserve his work. He looked directly at the psychologist, but not through violence. March nodded slowly. Holmes turned. Sebastian Crow disagreed. The collector's shoulders sagged. The fight had left him. Holmes's voice became cold. Crow had invested years in the project. A pause. Money. Another. Influence. Another. Reputation. He looked toward Lestrade. When Eleanor threatened disclosure, Crow followed her to Richmond. The inspector's eyes narrowed. The boathouse. Holmes nodded. The repaired floorboards. A pause. The carved message. Another. He was here. He looked directly at Crow. Eleanor left it. The collector said nothing, because he could not. Holmes continued. An argument occurred. A pause. She threatened exposure. Another. He attempted persuasion. Another. She refused. And in the struggle that followed, she fell into the river. The room seemed to exhale collectively. Not murder planned, not murder intended, but a death concealed, a crime compounded by cowardice. Holmes nodded. An accidental death became a deliberate cover-up. Crow finally spoke, his voice barely audible.
I didn't mean...
Then stopped, because there was nothing else to say. Lestrade stepped forward. Sebastian Crow, I am arresting you for the concealment of evidence, obstruction of justice, and your role in the death of Eleanor Ashcroft. Crow did not resist. 2 officers escorted him away. The door closed behind them, and at last the room relaxed, only slightly, because one question remained. Adrian Valle. It was I who spoke. Where is he? March answered. To my surprise, he is alive. Every head turned. The psychologist sighed. The poor man became obsessed. A pause. He feared he would be next. Another. So he hid. Holmes nodded. I suspected as much. March looked tired now, older. The experiment destroyed more lives than I intended. Holmes regarded him steadily. That is the nature of dangerous ideas. For several moments neither man spoke. Then March gave a small nod, almost respectful, perhaps even regretful. At length the gathering dispersed. Witnesses departed. Lestrade left with his prisoners. The studio emptied. Only Holmes and I remained. The portrait stood quietly in the center of the room, unchanged, exactly as it had always been. I looked at Eleanor's painted face. So that was the answer. Holmes slipped his hands into his pockets. Part of it. I smiled. Only part? He returned the smile faintly. The portrait never changed, Watson. A pause. But the people did. We stood in silence for a time. The rain had stopped. The fog was beginning to lift. London slowly emerged from shadow. At last I asked, what became of Eleanor Ashcroft's greatest clue? Holmes glanced toward the portrait, then toward the empty doorway through which Crow had departed. The clue was never hidden in the painting. A pause. It was hidden in human nature, and with that observation, characteristic both of his intellect and his philosophy, Sherlock Holmes took his hat and cane. Together we stepped into the cool London night, leaving behind the portrait, the experiment, and the ghosts of those who had mistaken expectation for truth. For if the case taught anything, it was this. A lie repeated often enough may shape belief, but sooner or later reality demands its evidence, and when it does, even the most carefully painted illusion cannot survive the light.